So, welcome to Getting Unstuck. Today, we're departing from our typical format of interviewing a guest about some aspect of change, and we're following our transformation story format, where we have a guest on who has gone through and continues to go through a major life change, and we typically talk about those shifts in three acts: where the person was, the catalyst that propelled them in a different direction, and where they are today. And we do this because we think that by sharing these types of stories, they can be inspirational for other people who may be stuck in that first phase, if you will, and are perhaps looking for the catalyst or ignoring the catalyst that might propel them in a different direction. Our guest today is Lorraine Flower, and I met Lorraine on LinkedIn. I had seen a comment that she left on on somebody else's post, and it was one of those comments where she took the conversation deeper, and it's to me kind of what you want to see on LinkedIn, if you will. That it's not just clicking like and going on to the next thing, but it's really adding to the conversation. So I looked her up on LinkedIn, and her profile really caught my attention. I'm going to read two sentences from it, if you will. A growing calling to bring the power of spirituality and consciousness into the business world led Lorraine to cut short her high-flying and diverse corporate career at the age of 38. Doing so changed the whole trajectory of her life. I knew that she was somebody we had to talk to because it's kind of the perfect transformation story format, if you will. So, Lorraine, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can tell us in three acts what you've been through and where you're going, and take it away.
Jeff, thank you very much. Just as you were reading those couple of sentences, the emotion that welled up inside of me was really quite strong, because it's a very evocative point in my life. Even though it's in the past, it still remains with me as a very particular feeling of both power but also grief at the same time. The point at which I decided to make a big change in my career, my life as somebody involved in the world of work, was in some ways very normal, traveling along the corporate road in the usual way. I was very blessed. I was able to move very quickly through the corporate hierarchy, and literally moved every couple of years into a different job. And most people, I think, perceived me to be someone who was going all the way, if we want to describe it that way. It was kind of we're going to be at the top of the field in traditional corporate terms. And as I was continuing on my journey, in parallel, there were inevitably things going on in my private life. I'd just ended a marriage not long before this kind of transformation stage kicked in. I had just started seeing somebody else, which in itself was very provocative, because he was not the most loving or kind person I'd ever spent time with. So there was a whole kind of question about what was I doing with that person. But also in terms of work, I was, but on that, I would say on the work front, I was incredibly happy. And this reflects, I guess, a key part of my life, which is that work is probably the thing that I am most connected with in my life. It's very vocational. It's very strong for me. And so this pathway was, set out before me. And no matter whatever else was going on in my life, work was my sanctuary in many ways, my career, my way of going forward. So in one sense, you'd kind of say, nothing particular to notice, except that increasingly, probably about, 3-4 years before I came to the decision to change my life, I had been doing more and more conscious spiritual inquiry. And I had also but it was light touch. It was, it hadn't taken center stage in my life at that point. The person that I was divorcing, or had divorced at that point, I'd met him in Bali. I had some really strong experiences, energetic experiences in Bali. So there were various bits and pieces that had started to nudge into my field of reference, but none of them had added up to anything particular at that point. They were pieces, they were all pieces. And but this last corporate job that I was in, I was really enjoying it. I had the honor, I would say, of helping an organization to shift its culture and its values, its way of working in a very traditional industry. And it was all going brilliantly well. So all looked set fair on the corporate sense. And then suddenly I woke up one day, literally woke up one day, and there was a voice in my head that said, okay, in a week's time, it's time for you to hand in your notice. And so I said to myself, don't be ridiculous, that's just not going to happen, put it out of my head and carried on. And later that week, I was traveling, as it happens, overseas with my boss, the chief executive, and we were sitting in the airport on the way back from our business trip, waiting to come home. And I said to him, I need to speak to you. And this impulse, I can only describe it as an impulse came through me. And in that moment, I said to him, I'm sorry, but I'm going to be resigning. Oh, goodness me, I can still feel that now. And the words were out, and it was like a genie out of a bottle. And I'm thinking, what have I done? And he was shocked. He said, we need to think about this. Is this right? Is it? Yes, I said, I need to do this. Now, this is from a space of a week before, thinking, what a ridiculous idea. And somehow it didn't even build in me consciously. It wasn't even something I could say I sat and thought about and, maybe this is the right thing to do. It literally was like an impulse that came through me. And it just happened. Now that's not necessarily helpful to others, but what I would say is that if you notice that there are many indicators, signs, pushes, provocations, whatever, you get a choice. I think you get a choice to cooperate with those and to do that in a nice, smooth and planful way, and make that next step on your journey. Or if, like me, you were noticing them but not really paying enough attention, then the soul takes over. The soul says, hey, hang on, this is how it's going to be. Now, I had plenty of opportunities to step back from that decision. When we got back, it was a weekend. I spoke with my boss the following week. He said, are you still serious about this decision? I said, absolutely, I am. Because by that stage, I realized that it just had to be done. It had to be done. So the catalyst was something in a sense beyond my control. And I noticed that for quite a long period of time afterwards, I was constantly managing my decision, is how I would put it. So I found myself constantly telling myself stories. Okay, so I've handed in my notice. I gave 7 months notice. That was one stage. Don't do it too quickly. I had to give 6 months anyway, but I gave as long as I possibly could. I worked right up to the last possible second. I gave everything in that period. So I was constantly telling myself I was doing this in the right way. And then I'd positioned this as, I'm just taking a year out. I'm going to take a year out, So for myself, to myself, it was, this is temporary. Don't worry about it. You'll be back. Then headhunters started calling, and I had the opportunity to consider another position about 6 months or so into my year out. And so I engaged in that conversation and accepted ultimately another job as a managing director of a healthcare company. And then 2 days before I was due to start, and it had been a 3-month selection process, they'd spent money, obviously, trying to recruit me. I rang them, and this seriously was the hardest call I've ever made in my life. And that was to tell them that had changed my mind and I would not be coming. That was hard for me on several levels. One, not letting people down, but secondly, knowing that in saying those words, I was not returning to the corporate world in the same way. I had no plan, by the way. I had no way, no alternative plan. But I, again, just had to face that cliff edge and take the decision, which is what I did. So it was only at that point that I realized that I really, really had consolidated that first action, which was to hand in my notice in the airport in Italy or wherever we were. And then it was, a year later that I actually consciously took the decision, knowing all that would entail as far as I could at that point, but that certainly that it was a point of no return.
Lorraine, go back just a little bit. When you said when you were in the airport and the words just kind of came out, and you said the soul takes over. You had seen signs before, but you may have dismissed them or just kind of ignored them. What kind of signs or what kind of feelings were those?
The first one that I would offer is I mentioned that I'd met this. I met and married a Balinese man, and I'd met him while I was on holiday, some, 7 years, 8 years prior to this, and there was something about that moment of, being in love. Okay, has its own kind of quality and feeling, and you feel free and you feel light and so on. But I noticed that I was very aware of being a different person. So there was almost like there were two of me. There was the me that lived my life back in the UK, and then there was the me that was joyful and happy and relaxed and easygoing and flowing. And we can argue that's just about you're on holiday and then you're not on holiday, but it wasn't even that. It was a sense of touching another part of myself and really seeing it. So that was one indication. Another was, again, to do with Bali. I was sitting on a rock in a kind of stream, looking at a temple that had been carved in the side of the cliff. Beautiful, beautiful setting. And for I don't know how long, I can describe it as a period of time, I disappeared. Now, I didn't physically disappear, but my consciousness moved to a different place. So I was in a sense out of time and space as we know it here on a physical earthly level. And when I came back to myself, I knew I'd connected into another energetic dimension, but I didn't have any frame of reference for what it was. So again, I just pocketed it and put it away and saw it as a phenomena, but not something I really had any information for. The boyfriend that I mentioned, he was constantly pushing at me with, work is all that matters to you. There's more to life than that. What else is going on for you? And these were all kind of earthly indicate. Well, that one particularly was quite an earthly indicator, but when I look at it now, I can see that there were one other really important one was my relationship with my first employer. I was there for 18 years, British Airways. It was my family. I joined when I was 18. I was there for 18 years. I thought I would be there for the whole of my life. And I started to fall out of love with it. And that, again, was another indicator that my maturing, my coming to myself, and at this stage I was, 34, 35. So in psychological terms, it's quite a key point in our lives. I didn't, again, know that at that time. But it was another nudge that said, the path that you think you're on is not the path that you will be on. Again, you rationalize these things and you think, well, okay, it's just about, you find another job, it gives you another step up in a way that you hadn't anticipated. But yeah, they were very everyday indicators, and yet when you take them all together, they were signaling a level of change. And in parallel, I was learning to get involved. I was getting involved in things like spiritual healing and joining. I became a Reiki master. So there was also a kind of growing pathway of exploring the world of spirit and consciousness.
You said the path you think you're on is not the path. What's the emotion connected to that for you? Was it fear? Was it strong interest? What were you feeling when you realized that you were going to take an exit off the highway?
Fear is the first word that the first emotion that I would put up there, and it's interesting. People often talk about courage and the courage to do this and the courage to do that. I have a kind of interesting sense of what courage really is, because what looks like courage to one person is just a walk in the park to somebody else. So courage is only when we meet our own boundary or our own point of limit, whatever that might be, and we have to push through it. So it was fear, and it did take courage to continue on this path I'd set rolling. But one of the things I notice about my own character or personality is that that when something needs to change, I seem to be able to give in to that impulse. So it was fear, it did take courage, and yet at the same time, I'm going to use the word knowing. There was a certain knowing that actually it was going to be okay. And that was not on a rational level. It wasn't on it was on a deeper truth sort of level. Is the only way I can describe it. And I didn't have a frame of reference to just, I didn't have people that I could talk through all of this with at the time. But there's something about, that fear is there, but you face it. I guess the pull from the other side is stronger.
That was actually, as you were describing the very first conversation that you were having with your boss in the airport, and you heard yourself saying something you hadn't anticipated saying. I was wondering about your reaction in that moment. Like, did you recognize it and go, look at that, that's true? Or was it sort of like, who said that and how do I pull it back?
How do I put those words back?
Like, what was it? I mean, obviously you could have had both of those going on, but like as you listened to yourself do that, what occurred to you related to what you said?
It's interesting because I can kind of feel that I was very emotional. I was upset. I could hear the words, and I knew it was me saying the words, and I could see that he was shocked by what I was saying, and I could feel what I can feel now, which is a sadness and a disbelief and a what are you doing, Lorraine? But that wasn't strong enough. It wasn't I couldn't stop it. It is the genie out of the bottle. When the genie wants to come out, you can't shove it back in. And
did you recognize the genie as it was coming out? Was there also a part of you that went, oh, thank God? Or was that too far away for you to even access at that point?
Too far away. Because I actually didn't feel, it wasn't like I was in a state of stress where, where people have got to burn out or have got to a place where, anything to bust the pain and get some relief. It really wasn't that for me. It was, my work life was it was my companion. It was my partner. It was my place of hiding, my place of expression. Everything about work in that context was positive for me. So I really was walking out on something that was very precious to me.
Mm.
But I had no way of. I didn't know what to do about it. What I knew was once I'd said it, I wouldn't go back on it. It's I don't know why I knew that, but I just knew once the words were out, I would not go back on it.
Awesome.
Had you ever felt, Lorraine, prior to the conversation in the airport, had you ever had these inner voices saying, you're meant to do something else? There's something else for you.
It showed up for me. I remember one time talking to a girlfriend who was also in the same company, very successful, and we were having a drink or something, and I did say to her, and I was a bit tentative about it, but I said, do you ever feel like you are that you have a wisdom and a connection, a sense of something bigger that you can't make sense of in your everyday life, that just kind of is bigger than most of the things you know? And I had that. We did have a bit of a conversation about it. She didn't really kind of get what I was talking about, but I did start to give voice to this idea that there was something else happening inside of me. Now, couple that with I've always, as just the way my life story is, and my place, and I don't know what I was born with, but I've always been ahead of my age, my I don't know. I've been in leadership positions, not just in the obvious career sense, but I've always been a little bit ahead of what would appear to be my circumstances. And so I would walk into situations. I'll give you an example. At the age of 21, I was working in British Airways, still early days. And I found myself as part of a team of very seasoned executives in British Airways negotiating a lease purchase deal with Boeing and 4 banks and 4 city solicitors. And we spent a year, and I was the primary negotiator with Boeing for the purchase contract for these aircraft, a fleet of 75.
At 21.
At 21. And I look at that now and I think, I wouldn't give a 21-year-old the money to go and buy my shopping. It's not quite fair, but you know what I mean? There's a sense of something that says and this isn't arrogance, this is just about life puts you in situations and gives you opportunities. And I think you have to recognize the privilege that comes with that and utilize those resources. For me, it was a job and I was doing what I was, and I was loving it and had a great opportunity, but it characterizes a lot of that wisdom or knowing that I think you're referring to, which is the guidance that comes that allows you to do things you didn't know you could do.
Mm.
I am so curious. So what happened after after that catalyst? Where did it lead you to?
Where did it go next? Yeah. So, there I am, 38 years of age, not married, no longer with the boyfriend. I have to say he'd moved on as well, thankfully. And I'm looking at this in very practical terms, thinking, well, there's a mortgage to pay, there's food to put on the table, and I had a bit of savings, but I'm 38, so God willing, somehow I have to fund myself. So in very practical terms, these were the sort of some of the early considerations. And to be fair to me, I didn't panic. I didn't kind of think, I've got to rush off and do something drastic. But in parallel, a different girlfriend of mine had been working independently in the HR consulting field. And we were very, very close friends. And she said, look, Lorraine, I've always wanted to have an opportunity to work with you because our paths had never crossed professionally. Why don't we set up a consultancy together? And again, I found myself saying, and I say that because it wasn't kind of fully thought through, but I said, okay, well, I'd be happy to do it, but it has to be about spirituality in the workplace. And she said, oh, okay, right. And so then I found myself saying more of what was to become a philosophy, a vocation, a belief. And this had been matched in parallel by a few trips actually to the US to attend some consciousness in business conferences that were running in the late 90s. And so I'd started to do some inquiry into that space anyway. But I realized that that was what I wanted to do. And so for the first couple of years, we set up a partnership, which isn't the business I run now, but exploring what this is, what is spirituality in the workplace. And that's how my next step started to unfold. But I have to say that the feeling of those first 20 years is only just leaving me now. So here I am, 40 years on from the first day of joining British Airways. And it's only now that I am able to truly accept that shift in life path. And I say that because perhaps, just on a pure personality level, but there's a seems to be a fundamental DNA in me that is that wonders about what might I have achieved? What might that have looked like? How would I have reconciled that path with this path? And if you've seen the film Sliding Doors, then it's that sort of sensation. So how do you square what might have been with what is? And that would have potentially been true the other way around too.
For our listeners, how do you define spirituality?
This has been, particularly as I've been working with spirituality in the workplace since leaving my corporate career in that sense. This has become a lifelong conversation. Now, on a personal level, I have a very deep set of spiritual beliefs and practices. They're not anchored in a religion. I was brought up a Catholic, but they're not. I left that when I was in my early 20s. So they're not anchored in a specific religion, and yet they have. You could recognize a number of the principles of those beliefs in many of the world religions. So for me, spirituality is about recognizing that our birthright is a level of joyfulness, a level of lovingness, a level of presence that is beyond our wildest dreams at this point as a humanity. But it isn't beyond our ability to access it. And we get fleeting moments when we touch it, maybe when we're out in nature, maybe when we're with a special person, maybe when we are when we achieve something. It can come in all sorts of different ways, but we get a glimpse of it. For me, when I look at a rose and properly sit and be with that rose, you get a deep sense of something that goes beyond the trials and tribulations, or even the supposed happinesses of human life, and see that you're actually part of something much bigger, much more profound, much grander, and that to achieve a place of persistent joy and persistent love, we have to work through the human condition. We have to work through the human process, and we're doing that work in an ideal world together. So for me, spirituality is a relationship with a higher expression of who we are as humans. It's an expression of our potential, and I wouldn't use the word promised land in most normal terms, but there's something about the joy that we could have every day in our livingness if we could only open ourselves to that potential.
So talk to me about how you marry that with the work that you do now. Like, how does that unfold in a typical workplace setting?
By working with the lenses that people recognize, or at least planting some lenses that they might recognize. So as you'll know from your own work, there is a growing movement towards really getting into emotional intelligence, really getting into proper relationships in organizations, bringing more humanness into the workplace. Your book that's coming out shortly, that these are developments that are happening from my belief system as a natural evolution of human growth. As well as stimulus that is being put in there. So in working with organizations, you can bring more conscious awareness to that. So I'm sure you find this, but so often in organizations, there's a sort of mental tick box approach to some of these things. Yes, in order to be an employer of choice, we have to pay a bit of attention to culture, or we have to say that, it's important to play nicely with each other or whatever. But I see the work that we do as about shifting that from the intellectual to the inner soul, heart space, so that it becomes a truth rather than a compliance from the legislation to the fundamental ownership belief. The kind of core part of leadership. So you can do that through emotional intelligence, you can do it through corporate social responsibility, you can do it through an examination of purpose and goals, and so you can use all of the structures of the workplace, but you elevate the exploration of those to a more fundamental value level rather than to a how do we comply or do it more efficiently.
And do you do that? I'm just sort of ticking through in my head. I mean, you referenced our book. Jeff and I talk a lot about kind of businesses where we're so designed to be smart, we forget about being healthy. That really shifting an emphasis, because we overemphasize all of the logical, planful ways to get things done, we tend to minimize the other. And by intentionally shifting towards really thinking about what does it look like to have a healthy workplace, you're really helping to balance that in a way that's very important. As when I heard consciousness and bringing consciousness, I was thinking, oh, okay, are we talking about, mindfulness lunch breaks, or like what are the mechanisms or tools or behavior that you're encouraging or that you see people using?
So the way we work, and there are lots of people who are starting to bring mindfulness into organizations, and I applaud that, and I think it has a value, and we use it ourselves as well in our work. But I think the way that we work, the way that I work, particularly with organizations, and it tends to be, in the case of a lot of the work I do with the very senior leadership teams, for me, it's about deepening the process of dialogue and inquiry. So it's about really helping them to challenge their own frameworks, their own principles for how they think, how they work, to hold the mirror up about the way in which the organization is playing out, the polarities, the balances within the organization, and linking that to their role as leaders. For me, leadership is such a fundamental cornerstone of the way in which organizations operate. Not because the wider people, the group of employees are not vital, they absolutely are. But still, at the moment, it's shifting. But at the moment, positional leaders, hierarchical leaders, still have a disproportionate effect on the way in which an organizational culture, an organizational set of norms are established. And until leaders really fully face the responsibility and the privilege that goes with being in one of those positions, then I don't feel we will see the ongoing shift, the fundamental shift that is needed in many organizations today. So for me, a lot of the conversation is, even something as basic. I remember talking to one many years ago now, to one leadership group, all very senior leaders, and I said to them, so what does it mean to you to be a leader? And to a person, their responses were, well, I'm responsible for finance, so I have to make sure that things run efficiently for finance. And I'm responsible for marketing, so I have to make sure that marketing plays its part in the organization. And what struck me was their inability to really connect with the whole notion of leadership. And so a lot of our work is in opening up that collective horizontal space of leadership as distinct from the vertical space of leadership, if I can put it that way. And by taking people into that horizontal space of leadership, it's not to do with my expertise, my technical prowess, my whatever got me there in career terms. It's about, who am I? How do I show up? What do I believe in? Who am I in that, in that role that I'm occupying, and what's my relationship with others in that space?
Well, as you're talking, Lorraine, I'm reminded of Brene Brown's work, and she talks about this dance of vulnerability and trust.
Yeah.
And if you can be vulnerable, you have a better opportunity to establish trust. And once trust is there, it eases the burden of vulnerability. And I'm curious, when you're working with leaders, as you, I just love this mental picture of vertical leaders. I'm marketing, I'm finance, versus the humanity of the horizontal, if you will. How do you break through and get them, get that kind of raw conversion to be vulnerable?
Well, you have to work in, well, A, it has to be over time, and B, you have to build a level of trust with these people, and I have to be prepared to be vulnerable in the space with them. So it's, I have to be, I'm not part of the team in the obvious sense, but you have to model some of that. So it's about trying to, I use a combination of approaches, but some of it's about setting that bar of aspiration. Some of it's about sharing, stories that demonstrate one's own vulnerability, and some of it's about gently inviting them into levels of disclosure with each other that has them seeing each other as human beings, not as job titles or as P&Ls or as whatever else their scope of responsibility might be. And it takes time. It's a slow process. And we spoke at before we started the conversation, Jeff, about astrology and Sagittarians. Well, I don't know if it's to do with that or other makeup within me, but I have this sense of constantly wanting to be ambitious and aspirational. So I have to contain within myself that desire to have everybody running at great speed towards this brave new world, and recognize that one has to go slowly, and not everybody's prepared to put that time in.
Can I ask a question I've been thinking a lot about? I have a colleague who recently accepted a position at a Catholic university, and one of the things that she expressed as interesting for herself is what a relief it is to be able to talk about her spirituality in an open way, because typically in a work setting, any discussion of a higher connection or a higher purpose is something that you have to keep to yourself. You have to like sort of box your own strategies about renewal and resilience and sort of inner guidance in language that sounds businessy, right? So how do you help people who are in positions of authority and are concerned about their image, as well as sort of potentially triggering adverse reactions in their staff if they start disclosing things about their own religious beliefs or their own spiritual sort of calling or exploration or inquiry? How do you help people navigate that?
Well, mainly that's done through one-to-one coaching relationships, because it's a very personal conversation, of course. And there are, it depends on the individual really, but there are ways of helping them to find a narrative, a language that they feel confident and comfortable with themselves. So when they look at their environment, what would one step or one stretch be that might open a door? How could they tell a story that is not using the word spirit or consciousness or whatever, but which indicates that they are accessing a different set of resources? But it depends on the individual level of confidence and maturity in some ways. Certainly I model speaking about it very openly. So we do speak about our underpinning philosophies. I do talk about my own spiritual journey and so on. So when any organization I'm in, these are things that I put on the table really from the get-go. But on an individual level, we all have to come to that place at our own time and speed. What I often find is that you can take a person a step or maybe two steps, and then they have to stop and consolidate for a while. And then something else will happen, and you may or may not be around and part of that conversation with them, but something else will take them to the next stage. So it's about helping them to see what stories or metaphors or language or disclosure is appropriate to where they're at, and that they feel they can land in the organization. And it is mainly about sharing some stories without necessarily saying, come and join me in church or come and do this.
Exactly.
It's not about, it has to not sound like you're recruiting people so much as talking about your own choices.
Lorraine, I feel like we've just scratched the surface, and this was an incredibly fast hour, and I feel honored to hear your story. And our listeners can't see you, but you have a genuineness and authenticity about you when you're talking about the transformation period, the catalyst. It's still very raw for you, and it just says how powerful and true that was for you. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. And thank you, Kirsten. Thank you. It's reliving these sorts of things is a privilege, because I know this will have moved me another step forward. So your generosity in asking me to speak is important to me too. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. And we want to have you back when your book comes out.
Okay.
And we can
I'm
talk
very
about
happy.
that. All right.
That would be great.
And if people want to get some more information about the work that you're doing, where would we send them?
Well, we have a website, so they can go to the website, which is www.azure.co.uk. So that would be one route. I'm on LinkedIn, as you said, so they can find me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect with them there. I can give you some other details of actual contact numbers if that's useful. But
very good.